Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel Sparkle English. My name is Jennifer and in today's lesson I'm going to talk to you about how to use punctuation in complex sentences. In my last lesson we talked about punctuating compound sentences. So first of all, what is a complex sentence? Well, a complex sentence contains one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. An independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, while a dependent clause cannot stand alone, and it's connected to an independent clause. For example, although it was raining, we went hiking in the mountains. This is a complex sentence, and you can see that we connect the dependent clause and the independent clause with a comma. However, we don't always use commas in complex sentences. But in this lesson, I'll teach you when to use a comma and when not to use a comma. The first step is identifying clauses. You have to know what an independent clause is. And an independent clause is a complete sentence that makes sense on its own. You could end this clause with a period and it would be correct. While a dependent clause is a group of words that does not make sense on its own. You could not end it with a period and make a complete sentence. For example, we went hiking in the mountains. This is an independent clause. It's a complete sentence. We have a subject, we, and a predicate, went hiking in the mountains. We are not left with any uncertainties or any questions after reading an independent clause. Whereas a dependent clause, although it was raining, this does not make sense on its own. We're left with questions. What do you mean, although it was raining? We know that there is more information that is necessary to make this a complete sentence. So let's talk about using commas with dependent clauses. So when a dependent clause comes first, when it comes before an independent clause, we use a comma after the dependent clause. For example, because Emily was tired, comma, she didn't stay out late. Because Emily was tired is a dependent clause. It cannot stand alone as it is. However, she didn't stay out late is an independent clause, and it can stand alone. So when the dependent clause comes first, we use a comma after it, before the independent clause. However, no comma is needed if the dependent clause comes after the independent clause. So we can reverse these clauses and we do not use a comma. Emily didn't stay out late because she was tired. So remember, a dependent clause, comma, independent clause. Otherwise, when the sentence begins with the independent clause, we don't use a comma. Let's look at another example. While I was living in Europe, comma, my sister had a baby. While I was living in Europe is a dependent clause, so we must have a comma after it. We could also reverse these clauses and not use a comma. My sister had a baby while I was living in Europe. Now, something you will notice is that dependent clauses usually start with words like while, if, when, and these words are called subordinating conjunctions. So let's talk more about subordinating conjunctions. Subordinating conjunctions connect dependent clauses to independent clauses. And common subordinating conjunctions include because, although, since, unless, if, when, while, after, before. There are many other subordinating conjunctions. For example, since they moved to the countryside, they've been very happy. Since is a subordinating conjunction and it begins this dependent clause. And this subordinating conjunction is what makes this a dependent clause. They moved to the countryside without since is an independent clause. However, when we add a subordinating conjunction, the clause doesn't make sense on its own. We need more information. Well, what happened after they moved to the countryside? What are you trying to tell me? And again, when the dependent clause comes before the independent clause, we use a comma. Here's another example. If you need any activity suggestions, you can ask at reception. If is a subordinating conjunction, and that turns this into a dependent clause. So now we're going to do a quiz to practice what you have learned from this lesson. If you find yourself struggling with knowing if a clause is dependent or independent, imagine someone said that clause to you. Would you understand exactly what they meant, or would you require more information? Would you be waiting for them to finish the sentence? And that will help you determine whether the clause is independent or dependent. So I'm going to read 5 different sentences, and you must add correct punctuation if the sentence requires it. Number 1. If Dan can get time off work, we will go to Montreal for the weekend. Number 2. Although the flight was delayed, my parents still managed to catch their connecting flight. Number 3. Everyone in the office stayed late on Friday because the project deadline was approaching. Number 4. While Barry lived in Spain, he visited Madrid, Barcelona, and Seville. And finally, number 5. We'll go to the cottage this weekend if the weather is nice. Let's begin with number 1. In number 1, we have a sentence that begins with a dependent clause. If Dan can get time off work. Remember, when we begin a sentence with a dependent clause, we must follow it with a comma. We have the subordinating conjunction if. And when that comes first, you know it's a dependent clause. So now it's correct. Number 2, we also have a sentence that begins with a dependent clause, although the flight was delayed. So once again, we need to follow the dependent clause with a comma. And now it's correct. Number 3, everyone in the office stayed late on Friday. Well, that is an independent clause. The dependent clause is because the project deadline was approaching. So number 3 is correct as it is. We do not use a comma after Friday since the sentence begins with an independent clause and finishes with a dependent clause. Now, number 4, the sentence begins with while, which is a subordinating conjunction. While Barry lived in Spain. So this must be followed with a comma because while Barry lived in Spain is a dependent clause that comes before the independent clause. So now number 4 is correct. And finally, number 5. We'll go to the cottage this weekend if the weather is nice. If is the subordinating conjunction, but it comes after the independent clause. So this is correct as it is. We do not add a comma. So let me know in the comments section how many you got correct out of 5. I have many other lessons on independent clauses, dependent clauses, and other punctuation lessons that are related to this. Make sure to check those out by checking some of my punctuation playlists. Thank you once again for watching, and I will see you all in my next lesson.